So following my last video where I talked about central contracts and how Ireland and Wales have recently made huge strides, I felt like it would be the perfect time to dive a bit deeper and talk about the possible power shift between the Northern and Southern Hemisphere nations, and answer the simple question: why has the gap between the Southern Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere closed? So to understand what the state of modern international rugby is and the changes it has made, we must first understand where we've come from. So let's take you back to the year 2005. The Lions were, unbeknownst to them, en route to one of the biggest ass whoopings of all time, in one of the most one-sided Lions series in history. This is where it was made abundantly clear that there was a humongous gap in class between the New Zealanders and the Lions, which included a lot of club teams running the Lions close, with the Maori completely outclassing the Lions in the rain. And when it came to the actual series, the gulf had never looked so big. The All Blacks completely outclassed the best that Britain and Ireland had to offer, with the All Blacks storming to a very convincing 21-3 victory in the first test. So after this, the Lions had to regroup, and after careful analysis, they decided that what they really needed to replace the magic of Brian O'Driscoll, who had mysteriously gone missing after the first test in minute 1, was a Welsh magician, Gavin Henson, who played well in midweek, which was a like-for-like switch in many ways. And from the first play of the game where Gareth Thomas goes rogue and scores a wonderful individual try, it seemed that having the majesty of Gavin Henson on the field was a winning formula. But then Dan Carter decided that he was going to show just how good he really was, and from a 7-0 lead, the final score turned out to be 48-18. What? Good lord, we were smoked. And then that third test happened, which the less said about that the better. But the point of telling this tale, other than having an excuse to watch the second test performance from Carter, was to show that this was once our reality, watching our heroes go up against the foreign Goliaths and constantly get their asses beaten in ways they never knew possible. But this is no longer the case. The world rankings have shown a marked improvement in the quality of the teams in the Northern Hemisphere, except France, and stay tuned for a video on what can be done to fix French rugby. And I have already done a video about how central contracts are the reason for the improvement of teams like Ireland and Wales and the constant success of the All Blacks. But let's look at all the progress of the big teams, starting with Wales. 2018 was a big year for Wales. After finishing second in a very competitive Six Nations, they went on to have an excellent summer where they beat the Pumas back to back. And to top it all off, they went through the autumn internationals unbeaten for the first time ever, finally beating the Wallabies, and now are the third best team in the world. Ireland, the Grand Slam winners of the Six Nations and the second best team in the world, who in 3 attempts have managed to beat the All Blacks twice, unheard of. And with another Grand Slam autumn internationals and now having the new best player in the world, they are poised to make a real World Cup challenge. Scotland! Scotland have to be the most improved team since 2005 from where they were, which was basically losing games to Italy, to now regularly defeating teams like the Wallabies and Argentina, and are the reason for the Six Nations now becoming one of the most competitive and exciting tournaments in the world rugby, with them becoming an actual threat and them playing their expansive quick tempo style that suits their best players, except Laidlaw. Like, I don't get Laidlaw in this team, but it works, but I don't know why. It's like an oxymoron. But anyway, they have completely blown the competition wide open and have the ability to beat anyone, having run the All Blacks pretty close in 2017, when usually the game between these two would be a formality. And now they have solidified themselves as a genuine threat to any team. England were doing really well with 2 Six Nations titles and matching the All Blacks' record for staying unbeaten, but then 2018 happened and it was altogether a bit of a shit show. But with a decent autumn, the wheels seem to be at least somewhat back on the tracks. Now, all of this would be a moot point if the Australian and South African teams had continued to improve, but that hasn't been the case, so let's look at the other and probably most crucial catalyst for why the gap has closed. Australia and South Africa have got worse. Now, I say this with a massive grain of salt. I do not mean that the Springboks and Wallabies have got worse at rugby since 2005. I mean that they have gotten worse at keeping up with the All Blacks, so that title should technically say that Australia and South Africa have got worse at keeping up with the All Blacks. And this wasn't the case until quite recently. If we look back at the 2015 World Cup in terms of international rugby cliches, it played out pretty much how you thought it might. England and the Northern Hemisphere nations all underperformed, with all of them not making it past the quarterfinals, thanks to Craig Schubert, and New Zealand winning everything in convincing fashion. But after that, every one of those nations has fallen in terms of the world rankings, except for New Zealand. Don't be silly. And I believe that I know the reason why. It's all about succession. I believe that the reason the All Blacks always have the edge is that in New Zealand it's all about succession, and making sure that the next generation has everything it needs to be successful. Now, teams in the Northern Hemisphere talk about doing this by giving a couple players some caps against Argentina and Fiji in the autumn internationals, but over in New Zealand they're a lot more committed to this, and everything is geared towards evolution. They do not fear players like Dan Carter retiring because they've already got Bowden Barrett on the bench in the World Cup final ready to make an impact and take up the mantle. And this isn't just about blooding promising youngsters and playing them in games that matter. The mindset of club rugby over there is always geared to the next big thing, and there's always a natural progression of things if you're a player over there, which a lot of the time works like this. If you're a good player in Super Rugby, you try your hardest to become All Black, as that is the peak, the goal. And if that doesn't happen for you, at least you become an amazing player anyway and improve the level of quality in Super Rugby. And then you do 5 or 6 seasons in Europe or Japan to boost the bank and live a happy, peaceful life back in New Zealand. Or, if you're good enough to play for the All Blacks, the system is slightly simpler. You play for the All Blacks Blacks for as long as you physically can, pushing your body to its absolute limits till you can't anymore, and are replaced by a younger, new and improved version of yourself. You then go to Europe or Japan, but only have to play about 3 seasons, and then you probably can retire back to your homeland, but you linger on in these teams for slightly too long, and kind of ruin your legacy a tiny bit. But the point of all that is the key to their constant success is their embrace of change. They were the only team at the World Cup who didn't have to completely rebuild, apart from Ireland maybe, even though on the surface it seemed like they would be extremely weakened by the loss of key players like McCaw, Mialamu, Muliaina, Nonu and Smith. But unbeknownst to everyone else, they had already been preparing for this point, and they would not only avoid growing weaker, they would actually go from strength to strength. An example of this is them immediately creating a new golden boy to pull the strings in Bowden Barrett, and altogether a new generation to dominate the rugby world. And teams like Ireland have managed to keep pace with the All Blacks and have seemingly embraced a very similar philosophy to the All Blacks in terms of succession, with Farrell being chosen as their next coach, similar to how Hansen took over from Graham Henry, as well as the blooding of promising youngsters like Jordan Lamont and the emergence of the exceptional Jacob Stockdale, hopefully ensuring that a similar situation doesn't happen to them after the 2019 World Cup as it did in the 2015 World Cup to other teams like South Africa, which were crippled by the loss of their biggest players and biggest stars. And there are loads of other things that can be done for Northern Hemisphere rugby to improve, mainly involving the French and the English fixing the fuck up. But I believe that until all the Northern Hemisphere big guns completely embrace these same philosophies in terms of succession and evolution, I fear that this closing of the gap between the two hemispheres will simply be a blip in the history of international rugby. Kind of like when England won the World Cup.